peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Now and Then Beach Pyjama sew along. So today we're actually going to be constructing the beach pyjamas, so let's get started. Okay, so we've got the instruction booklet here, and there is a lot of information for you here, just saying that the seam allowance is 15mm unless otherwise marked on the pattern piece. Fabric should be ironed smooth before cutting. I've already told you that. It also has lay plans for you for how to cut your fabrics, and you can do it from narrower fabrics, so 112cm wide, or wider fabrics, 138cm wide. So they have the two different lay plans there. If you do want your pockets and your fabric isn't wide enough for you to do that, there is an allowance for you to cut separate pockets, and there is a separate pocket piece for you to do that. When the pattern pieces are marked grey, that means that's the wrong side of the pattern piece or the fabric. And also it just says here, press at every stage of your dressmaking. It helps avoid the homemade look. So I have marked in all of my notches. I have marked on my darts, and I have marked on the pivot point here at the front, and I've done that with my friction pen. The pattern suggests that you use tailor's tacks, which is a definite possibility. Personally, I prefer the friction pen. So the first step that the pattern would like you to do is create the buttonhole. And I have a scrap piece of fabric that I have interfaced, and I'm going to trim this down to a regular shape once I've put the buttonhole in, and I'm going to use my pinking shears for that as suggested here. You can also do a bound buttonhole. These are going to be day-to-day, everyday wear for me, so I'm going to use a regular buttonhole from my machine. I think that's going to work really well. So you want to make the buttonhole on the inside of the right front as worn only. So with the way you want to look at that is when you have it'll be the right hand side on you as you're wearing it. So and I have marked on my buttonhole placement on that piece. Buttonhole placement. So the right hand side as you're wearing the garment, that's where the buttonhole needs to go. You also want to take into consideration the width of the tie that you're going to be using. Mine's going to be 1 inch wide, so I'm going to do a 3/4 inch buttonhole. If you're using a smaller tie or ribbon, you can use a smaller buttonhole. So I have made my buttonhole. I have used some fray check on it, which is still drying, and then on the back I have trimmed down the interfaced piece of fabric that I've put on there with my pinking shears, and I'm going to leave that like that. So the next thing that we want to do is pin all your darts. So I've pinned the bust darts in the front pieces on both pieces. There's some pins in there somewhere. Yes, there they go. There's those. And then I've also pinned together the ties. Now the ties aren't actually included in the pattern instructions because we've added those. So I'm actually going to sew these first, and I allowed a 3/8 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to sew from the blunt end all the way down to the tapered end. I'm going to reduce my stitch length when I get to this point, pivot there, sew off the end and back stitch, and then turn these the right way out. So I've sewn the ties together at 3/8 inch all the way around, pivoted there and sewn off the edge there. I've then trimmed the edge with my pinking shears because this fabric is very prone to fraying, so I'm now going to turn these the right way round. Ties are done and turned. I'm now going to sew the darts in the bodice. I'm going to get as many processes done whilst I'm sat here before I get up and go to the iron, because I find that's just a more efficient way of working and it's my preferred method. So when you're sewing your darts, you want to back stitch at the start, and then you want to sew off of the end and leave yourself some long tails. And then you are going to knot them 2 or 3 times. And then trim off the excess. And you want to do that for the fisheye darts in the back of the bodice as well. I'm going to show you how I sew those when we get to them though. So when you're sewing the fisheye darts along the back, what you want to do is start in the middle at the widest point, sink your needle down, back stitch, and sew off the end of the dart and tie that in a knot. And then you want to do the same thing to close up the other side of the dart. So turn it over, sink your needle down where you back stitched, back stitch again, and then go and sew off the end of the other end of the dart so that you've closed that end up, and tie that off as well, and that way you have sewn your fisheye dart. This is future Sian talking here. I managed to delete the footage I had of the fisheye darts, what they look like when they were sewn up. So I have come back and filmed this to insert into the sew along with the magic of editing. So what you want to do with the fisheye dart is you want to start at the widest point, which is here in the middle, and you want to back stitch there and then sew down and sew off of the end and tie that in a knot as I did with the front bust darts. You want to then come back, sink your needle into the same spot, back stitch there to secure your stitching, and then sew up the other side of the fisheye dart, and again come off the end, tie the cotton into 3 knots and trim the excess off, and then you want to press these into the middle. So this is what your fisheye darts should look like once you've done that. Okay, so after sewing up the darts, the next thing that we need to do is sew the shoulder seams. So sew together, neaten and press open, and you can probably guess what method I'm going to use. I am going to French seam them. So what you actually want to do is pin them together, wrong sides together, sew at 1/4 inch, trim, press, and then come back and sew it at 3/8 inch. So this is the shoulder seam. I have pinned it together to the front to the back, wrong sides together, and I'm going to sew across here at 1/4 inch. Okay, so once you've sewn at 1/4 inch, you then want to trim off the excess. So you want to trim that seam allowance in half, so you've got 1/8 inch left there. So I'm going to do that all the way along, and once I've trimmed all that off, I can now go and press everything. So I'm going to press my waist ties, I'm going to press my darts, and I'm going to press my shoulder seams. Now for the darts, you want to press the front darts down and the back darts inwards. Okay, so I have pressed the shoulder seam so that the pieces are lying right sides together, and I've pinned that, and I'm now going to sew this at 3/8 inch, which will enclose that seam that we have just sewn, and that's how you do a French seam. If you've watched any of my other sew-alongs, you already know this, but just in case, I'm a fan of the French seam. Okay, so that's the French seam closed up, and then on the right side, all of the raw edges will be enclosed. So what we need to do now is press those seams to the back. Okay, so there are actually directions here for the ties, and the pattern suggests 10 centimeters wide by 70 centimeters long. I have gone for 2 inches wide and 40 inches long. I have no idea how that compares. I think mine are actually quite a bit longer, but the method for sewing them is exactly the same as I have shown you. The only difference is that I'm going to attach mine now, and this is the last step for this before you hem your beach pajamas. So I'm going to attach mine into the crossover point now so that I can encase the raw edges in the binding. Okay, so I have stay stitched the neck edge from the dot all the way around to the back center seam. Now we need to clip up to the dot, and then we're going to bind the edges. So we're going to clip right up to that dot there so that the seam allowance for the crotch is free, but we can bind the front edges of the pajamas. Okay, so we're going to attach our waist ties, and I have them on the rounded point, and it's kind of lining up with the buttonhole that we did first, and I have got the seam on the waist tie at the bottom facing towards the bottom of the trousers. I've got it pinned to the wrong side of the beach pajamas, so I'm going to tack that down, and then I'm going to sew the bias binding on top of that. Okay, so I'm sewing on the binding, and the way that I like to do it is I'm going to sew the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the garment. I'm using my normal foot and actually the same colour thread at the moment. I'm going to switch over to black when I top stitch it down, and I don't pin it. I have the reel in my lap, and I am going to sew all the way around the edge. I've left quite a long tail at the start, and I'm also going, when I get to the past the shoulder seam, I'm going to show you how I'm doing that area, because I'm going to finish it slightly differently to the way the pattern calls for. Okay, so when you get towards the center back seam, I've actually stopped mine a good sort of 4 inches away from the back seam, and I'm going to cut this and leave myself a really long tail, because the way the pattern would like you to do it is sew off the end and then finish the binding by hand when you sew up the back seam. Personally, I am going to French seam my back seam, and that will, if I did that with this binding on, that would be a lot of bulk in that area. So I'm going to leave this free, and then I am going to finish the binding at the end once I've sewn the back seam together. Okay, so for top stitching my binding down to the right side, I have switched over to black thread in the bobbin and the top thread. I have also put in my blind hem foot, which I use as an edge stitch foot. I think Mum's actually bought an edge stitch foot, so I really ought to dig that out and use that, but this works perfectly. So I use this guide to run up against the edge of the binding, and I have moved my needle all the way over to the left. Okay, so with the work with the right side up, I'm going to fold the binding over the edge, and I do this by hand. You can pin it if you find you need to, but I find that I find it much easier to do by hand. Now when you get to the waist tie, it's caught in at the back here, so you want to make sure that your waist tie is out to the left and out of the way when you're top stitching your binding down around this area. And I'm going to come back a little bit later once I've done this round, and I'm going to top stitch it down on this side as well to keep the tie in place. Okay, so I've top stitched all of the edge of the binding down, and I've gone back in and I have top stitched down so that the ties will stay facing out, and I've actually stopped the top stitching of the binding around the shoulder seam because of the way that I want to finish this. Because if I had top stitched right down to where I'd stitched there, I wouldn't be able to get in and finish stitching the binding down inside, because the top stitching would be too close. So I have given myself a good sort of 3 inches in there. So I'm just going to do the other one, and then I'm going to give them a good press. Okay, so the next thing it would like us to do is sew the front crotch seam together. I am going to French seam this, which will give me my 2 lines of stitching, which will reinforce this seam, and I'm going to do it in the same manner that I did with the shoulder seams. Okay, so I've done my first line of stitching in the crotch for the French seam, so I am now going to press, I've trimmed it as well, I'm going to press this, and then I'm going to do the second line of stitching, and that needs to meet up with the point that we marked earlier and then where we've sewn our binding up to. So the next step is number 6, and it's the crossover. So we want to position the right front crossover as worn, so that's the bit that we put the buttonhole into, and that's going to be on top of the left one. And you want to fold the binding end under, then tack all the way across onto the binding underneath. So it should end up looking something like this. So the binding has been folded under on itself, and we're going to do a line of stitching from here all the way over to here, and I've put a pin in it to mark where I'm going to finish. And so we've got the right crossover on top of the left crossover, and everything is lying flat and everything is kind of pinned into place. I'm going to use my blue thread to do this part, and then I'm going to swap over and use black thread to sew this bit down. Now on the inside there's kind of a lot of binding going on, so this is why I left extra long tails earlier. So what I've done is I have the French seamed crotch seam pinned under the binding there, and then I've folded over this binding, which is from the opposite piece. I folded that over and I've pinned that down so that when I top stitch down, that's going to all get caught. And I've got this one poking out at the end, and once I've sewn it from the front, I'm then going to come to the inside and I'm going to neaten this all up and hand tack it down to the seam allowance. So this is probably the most complicated part of the whole pattern, and it is literally a case of just fussing with it until you get it to lie flat like this. It is doable. This is the first time I've done this pattern, and it's one of those things, you need to fuss with it. It will get there, and once it does, it will look like it makes sense. You can see here, this is where we're going to be stitching down. So you want to be getting this to look like this. So this is the crotch seam, which is there. This is the binding, so we've got the top stitching on the binding there, which is there, and then I've just folded that raw edge underneath, and I'm going to top stitch that down and then top stitch the binding down on the other side. So I'll show you what it looks like when I'm finished. So I haven't pressed it yet, but it is finished. I've done a line of stitching with the blue thread, and then I've stitched the bias binding down with the black, and then on the inside I've kind of made it up as I've gone along, but I've tucked the end of the bias binding under itself and stitched it down, and I've done the same with this one, and I've just tucked the underneath the end of the bias binding underneath and stitched it to the seam allowance for the crotch. So this, as I say, I've not pressed it yet, but that is that step done. This little piece here is where I had snipped up to allow me to put on the binding and sew the crotch seam. So I have just got to put a little bit of fray check on that so that that stays, that doesn't fray. Right, got to press it, and then we're going to sew up the back seam. Right, so the next one we're going to do is step number 7, and that's sew up the back seam. And as you will remember from earlier, I have left the binding loose because I'm going to finish it off once I have sewn the seam up. So I'm going to French seam this so I have it right sides together. Now there is a curve in this one, and you could do the 3/8 of an inch seam first, trim that, and then sew with the 1/4 of an inch seam, and that actually works really well for French seaming curves and princess seams, things like that, things that need to be clipped as this seam does. So I'm going to give that a go. Okay, so I have French seamed the back seam and I have pressed it, and I have now sewn the binding from where I had left it loose from sewing it onto the neckline at the beginning right up to and stopping at the seam line. I've then done the same on the other side, and then I don't know if you'll be able to see it. From that line of stitching where I've stopped right at the seam line, I have then sewn the binding together, and I'm going to trim off the excess, which means that when I turn it to the other side, I'll be able to top stitch this down. And as you can see, I've changed my thread over to the black thread because I'm going to be top stitching it, so I want it to blend in with this. Okay, so once you've sewn the seam together at the middle of the binding, you then want to flip it over and continue the top stitching that you did earlier. So yeah, here we go. This is where I finished earlier, so I have just carried it on, got to this point, pivoted, and then finished the top stitching on this on the other side. And I've given this a press, so that's the neckline finished. And I used my blind stitch foot as I did earlier with exactly the same settings that I used earlier for top stitching. That's one of the things you want to do with top stitching, is make a note of the settings that you're using and then use the same one throughout the projects to give the top stitching a continuous and seamless look. Okay, so I've not added pockets to mine, so I'm going to skip this step, and we're going to move on to sewing up the side seams, and that is as diagram 7. So I'm going to be sewing from the bottom of the armhole all the way down to the bottom of the leg, and I'm also going to be stitching together this seam here, so the inside legs. And again, I'm going to be French seaming, so what you want to do is wrong sides together, pin everything, stitch it at 1/4 of an inch, trim, press, and then finish off the French seam with a 3/8 of an inch stitch, and I'll show you as I go. Right, so I have sewn up the side seams, I've sewn up the inseam, all at 1/4 of an inch and all with the wrong sides together. I am now going to go and trim that down to 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to press them, and I'm going to sew them again at 3/8 of an inch so that all of the raw edges are enclosed, and I have French seamed the inside of the jumpsuit. Okay, so I have finished all of the seams off, which means that all of the raw edges are enclosed, and we have a nice neat finish on the outside. If I can get it there we go. So yeah, nice neat finish on the outside and also on the inside. Now I need to press all of the seams, and I'm going to press them towards the back. Okay, so we've just done the side seams and I did the inside seam, leg seam at the same time, and because we have French seamed you don't need to worry about the neaten, but you do need to press. So I've pressed all of my seams towards the back. Now I'm going to hem my trousers because I'm set up for blue thread at the moment and I need to change over to black thread when I put the binding on the armhole. So I'm going to hem my trousers, and I'd added an extra inch and I think I need to turn it up by that inch, so I'm going to do the narrow rolled hem method, but I'm not going to make a narrow rolled hem, I'm going to make just a rolled hem basically. So I'll show you what I'm doing as I do it. Okay, so I sewed a line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch and then I have pressed that up, which is the beginnings of a narrow rolled hem. Now if you were going to do a narrow rolled hem you would continue to stitch along that line again, trim back and then turn it under, but I want quite a wide hem, so I've stitched at 3/8 of an inch. I have pressed it up so that it's at 1/2 an inch, so the stitching line you can just about see there, and then I've pressed it up again so that I have got the hem has taken up an inch of the fabric, which is the extra inch that I added. I'm going to use my edge stitch foot again because I'm going to run the guide here, this part, along this edge of the fabric, which will give me a nice line of top stitching on the hem. So I'm going to do that now. I've decided to try something a bit different with my binding, and this is a method that I have read about, so I thought I'd give it a go. So when you start sewing your binding in, you fold back the raw edge and you sew that down in the ditch that's created in the fold, and then when you come to finish it you just carry on and sewing over an extra inch so that they overlap, so that when you turn them round to the right side it's finished like this. Because usually what I would do is I would leave a tail end and stop there, tail end and stop there. I'd then make them meet in the middle, sew a line there and then finish it that way. So I thought I'd try something different this time, so this is what I have done. I've sewn the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the fabric. I'm now going to turn it all the way around to the outside and top stitch it down, and I'm going to do that with my edge stitch foot or my blind hem foot again. I haven't pressed it yet, but I think that's worked out quite neatly, so yeah, pleased with that. And these are now finished, just for one final very good pressing. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below and I will do my very best to answer them for you. All of the links for all of the things that I have featured in this video are included in the description box down below, so check that out. So I absolutely love these, and I do intend to make a couple more versions because I think these are going to be lovely to wear around the house. If we ever get summer, it's absolutely peeing down with rain out there. If summer ever turns up, these are going to be fabulous to wear around the house and feel very put together, very glamorous and yet comfortable. So not so secret PJs, but yeah, the PJs are in the name, but yeah, I'm really happy with them. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!